Chapter 811 Train Ride. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. Sunny had never thought that he would leave the city one day. He had barely ever thought that there was anything beyond the city, actually. More than that, for him, the city proper itself had always seemed like an alien land. His whole world used to start and end with the outskirts. Tens of millions of people who lived in the outskirts had a very special relationship with the wilderness beyond. They spent their lives much closer to it than real citizens, and were not separated from it by the tall barrier walls that encompassed powerful air filters. On one hand, it made them more attuned to the existence of the outside. On the other hand, they associated the outside with death, disease, and starvation on a much more visceral level. To them, the wilderness meant death in a very practical sense of the word, as opposed to distant and purely theoretical. That was why Sunny felt very weird as he stared at the train that was supposed to take him to the rendezvous point where Master Jet was supposed to meet him. The long-range transcontinental train did not look anything like the light intracity ones Sunny was familiar with. It resembled a massive, heavily armored metal beast that stretched for hundreds and hundreds of meters, its long body composed of various bulky segments. There were passenger carriages, massive cargo carriages, various utility carriages, and even a mobile repair and fabrication unit capable of restoring damaged sections of the railway should the train encounter any hindrances on the way. Rows of large caliber turret, automated cannons, and gun emplacements rose from the roof, manned by the railroad technicians and security officers. It was a fearsome, moving fortress. Anything less would not have been reliably safe, considering that the government rarely paid attention to the nightmare gates that opened away from population centers. Sunny studied the train curiously for a while, then went ahead and found the carriage he was assigned to. As a master, he was entitled to ride in the lavishly furnished car meant for high-ranking citizens, government officials, and members of legacy clans. He also got a whole cabin to himself. The cabin was comparable in size to his room at the academy, but much better stocked and equipped. Sunny threw his backpack on a shelf and sat down near the window, enjoying the softness of an expensive-looking armchair. A strange expression appeared on his face. Well, as far as wars go, this one is weirdly opulent so far. Of course, he was sure that these luxurious conditions would not last long. No one had bothered him until the train started to move, slowly at first, then faster and faster. Soon, the familiar sights of the city and the outskirts flew by, and the great metal beast finally escaped into the wilderness. Sunny felt a solemn mood overcome his senses. Despite spending years of his life in the much more wild and untouched reaches of the dream realm, he somehow felt as if he was stepping outside human civilization for the first time. He held his breath as the various human-built structures disappeared behind. However, the actual landscape of his world did not make any impression on him. It was just sort of boring. The wild expanse of the northern quadrant mostly looked like a desolate, empty place. It was almost entirely made out of mud and snow. Whatever flora still clung to life in the barren soil looked sickly and dull. The sky was heavy and gray, and the air was slightly hazy. Apart from occasional skeletal carcasses of dead nightmare creatures or rusty wrecks left behind from the times of human wars, there was nothing much to look at. Sunny sighed. What a waste. The waking world was not entirely uninhabitable, but it was certainly inhospitable to the species that had once populated its every corner. Maybe Effie had been right, back when they spoke in the ruined cathedral of the Dark City. He stared through the window for some time, then stood up and walked to a narrow bed, deciding to go to sleep early. This was probably going to be his last opportunity to rest well for a long, long time. It would have been a shame to let the opportunity go. Burying his face in a soft pillow, Sunny closed his eyes and soon fell asleep. At some point during the night, he was awakened by strange vibrations spreading through the frame of the train. Looking up, he saw pale flashes of light outside the window and heard distant, muffled pounding. The turrets on the locomotive and front carriages of the train were firing. Since none of his shadows, which were standing watch, seemed alarmed, Sonny sighed, turned on his other side, and closed his eyes again. Soon, he was back to sleep. He dreamt of ice and darkness. In the morning, the train was moving forward as if nothing had happened. Sonny had expected as much, so he wasn't surprised. After freshening up in the small bathroom attached to the cabin, he walked over to the dining car and had a scrumptious breakfast. The cooking could not compete with the instructor's cafeteria at the academy, of course, but it was decent enough. As he ate, Sonny studied the other people present in the carriage. Most of them were government officers and had a military bearing. A few of them were awakened, and gave him respectful nods. Even though nothing about Sonny revealed that he was a master, they were able to sense it. Most of these people were probably traveling south for the same reason that he was. They were going to Antarctica, as well, so the mood in the dining car was somber. No one talked very much, and those who did kept their voices low. Sonny doubted that all the participants of the massive operation knew the full scope of the disaster that was approaching the southern quadrant. In fact, he was willing to bet that very few were as well informed as he was. More than that, none of them probably had as much battle experience as he had. If they understood the real horror of what was about to come, they wouldn't be so calm. He did not really know how to feel about that. The next morning, the armored train finally reached its destination. Sonny disembarked from the lavish carriage and froze for a moment, staring at the endless gray expanse of restless waves. In front of him was the sea. Chapter 8:12 Naval Convoy. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. As Sonny already knew, water was the optimal way of transporting cargo, and people, across vast distances. Human civilization had always made use of this property to its benefit. The earliest paths of trade and cultural exchange, and therefore progress, were situated along great rivers, and later shifted to seas and oceans. That had led to many prominent civilization centers being situated along various coasts. However, humanity had regretted that fact dearly when the water slowly crawled forward and devoured all those beautiful, important cities. Even worse, once the nightmare spell appeared, seas and ocean became infested by terrifying nightmare creatures. For that reason, very few populous settlements were situated near water. The further inland they were, the better. Humans still needed to make use of the convenience that only the ocean could provide, though. For that reason, there were many fortified ports in each quadrant. Sonny was looking at one such port. Even after experiencing the dread and grandeur of the forgotten shore and the chained isles, he could not help but feel a bit of awe. The port itself looked like an unassailable fortress, with tall walls rising from the water and various fortifications protruding far into the bleak waves. Colossal cannons were aimed at the horizon, ready to bring down hell on anything that would dare to approach the crowded harbor. Various Spelltech defensive measures brimmed with energy. He had no doubt that even more were hidden underwater. Much more impressive than the port itself, however, were the ships. Sonny froze when he saw them. Around 40 metal leviathans were anchored along the shore, each more than a kilometer long and as tall as a castle. Their hulls bore such thick and heavy armor that it seemed strange for these mountains of steel to stay afloat. Some seemed shiny and new, but most bore deep, giant, ugly scars. Many armor plates were bent and corroded, while some were deformed by some unknown titanic blows. Each ship possessed a plethora of armaments, ranging from heavy artillery cannons to rapid-fire anti-air guns and snub-nosed mortars. Rows of rockets, missiles, and torpedoes could be seen in the hidden nests. The main cannons seemed especially fearsome, most of them resembling oversized railguns that stretched the whole lengths of the vessels. Each of the railguns was capable of propelling a heavy kinetic round with such ferocious speed that barely any human structure would have been able to survive the impact. Maybe not even a whole district would. The ships rested on the water like slumbering giants. Looking at them, Sonny couldn't help but shiver. Humanity was accustomed to regarding the awakened as their most deadly weapon, so it was easy to forget how mighty and destructive mundane people could be with the help of the right technology. Sadly, the technology grew less and less reliable against nightmare creatures of higher ranks. Fallen abominations could more or less shrug off the most devastating of bombardments, while corrupted ones were capable of surviving nuclear blasts. Science couldn't explain the principles at work in these instances, but plenty of empirical evidence had been gathered, to ruinous results, during the early days of the nightmare spell. So, despite how impressive the 40 steel leviathans looked, Sunny knew that the ships alone were not enough to brave the ocean. Unless they were complemented by awakened fighters and guided by a Nightwalker navigator, even these floating juggernauts weren't capable of surviving the journey to a different quadrant. Still, Sunny couldn't help but admire the silent majesty of them. One thing is certain, that train is nothing, as it turns out. As he stared at the fleet, a familiar voice suddenly called out to him. "Hey, Sunny. Welcome to our small port." He turned his head slowly. Master Jet had not changed much. She was still the same, confident, beautiful, with raven black hair and cold, icy blue eyes. Her usual uniform was gone, though, replaced by a deep blue military trench coat. There was a satisfied smile on her lips. The crowd of people parted as she walked closer and glanced at the anchored ships. "Impressive, aren't they?" Sunny lingered for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, now that I see them, I am starting to understand how we are going to evacuate 800 million people from Antarctica." Soul Reaper shook her head. "Don't be so sure. This is just one of the several convoys that is going to sail to the southern quadrant. They are going to deliver the first evacuation army to Antarctica, load up a few millions of refugees, and sail back. If everything goes well, by the time the ships return, the mobilization would have already started. The fleets will bring us reinforcements, take more civilians aboard, and repeat the process as many times as it takes." She sighed. "Of course, there's more or less zero chance that everything will go well. Even if it does, it will take us at least a year to gather everyone, if we are still alive by then. Who knows, maybe we will be all overwhelmed and devoured by abominations in the first few months." Sunny glanced sideways at her, his expression bleak. "You really know how to raise morale, you know." Master Jet grinned. "Ah, don't be so serious. In any case, I am really glad that you decided to join the party, Sunny. I really need someone who I can trust by my side. Don't get me wrong, my other subordinates are all honorable and accomplished warriors, but they're not you." He blinked a couple of times. "I didn't know I was so special." She looked at him, then shrugged and started walking away, prompting Sunny to follow. It takes a certain kind of person to face the very depths of despair, and still continue to fight. "You are one such person, Sunny." Soul Reaper glanced at him, then added in a voice that was devoid of any humor. "And we will all experience a lot of despair in the coming months. I have a feeling." Chapter 813 First Evacuation Army. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Master Jet led him to an armored military PTV that stood a few meters away from the crowded platform. It seemed that vehicle access to this part of the station was heavily restricted, but she paid it no attention. Apparently, her rank and status tramped some of the rules. The PTV itself was very different from the civilian models Sunny was accustomed to, as well as the heavier police cruiser he had ridden on occasion in the past. It was much more robust and angular, weighted down by several layers of composite armor, and entirely grounded. Even if the vehicle possessed limited levitation ability, it was perfectly capable of traversing natural terrain on its own. As they entered the cabin, towering humanoid loader robots moved in to unload cargo from the train, piloted by servicemen who could be seen in the open cockpits. The crude exoskeleton platforms were devoid of armor and failed to reach the smoothness of motion, scale, and sophistication of their military siblings, but were more than enough to perform various labor-intensive utility tasks. The PTV roared to life, startling Sunny. It seemed that the distinctions from civilian models were even more pronounced below the surface. The systems propelling the vehicle forward were entirely different, producing much more noise and vibrations, but also raw power. The PTV shot forward, narrowly avoiding several barriers before reaching the primitive cement road that led to the port. As they came closer and closer to the naval fortress, Sonny was able to study the swarm of activity boiling all around it. Currently, the port became a staging ground for a much greater force than it was designed to accommodate. Thousands upon thousands of government servants and soldiers were busy with frantic preparations for the approaching deployment. Numerous recently assembled prefab buildings stood in neat squares, some meant to provide the personnel of the 1st Evacuation Army with a temporary place to live, some serving as storage depots, production hubs, training facilities, field hospitals, and so on. A lot of heavy machinery was constantly moving between these squares, either transporting cargo or participation in the disassembly of various structures. Despite the impressive scope of the military camp, its makeshift and transient nature was apparent to the naked eye. The army was already busy deconstructing many of the buildings in order to move their components to the holds of the 40 battleships. Thousands of humans swarmed the camp like ants. Sonny saw a lot of non-combatant servicemen hurrying to accomplish their tasks, as well as plenty of soldiers busy with training exercises and drills. Some of them were awakened, but most were mundane humans. There were all types of specialist units in view: engineering corps, mechanized infantry that moved around in fearsome exoskeleton armor suits, artillery vehicle operators, and many more that Sonny could not name. He even saw several mobile war platforms that resembled giant cyclops forged of metal, ranging from 6 to 10 meters in height. These humanoid robots and their pilots left an especially strong impression on him. They were nothing like the primitive loaders he had seen a few minutes ago. Even though Sonny knew that these machines were built and operated by humans, he couldn't shake off the feeling that he was looking at hulking nightmare creatures. Slowly, the scale and scope of the upcoming operation started to dawn on him. Sure, he had known the approximate numbers for a long time, but knowing and seeing were two different things. Sonny lingered for a few moments, then asked in a slightly hoarse voice. "You said that there would be several such convoys." Master Jet nodded as she easily controlled the PTV. "Yes. For now. 2 will sail from the northern quadrant, 1 from both the eastern and the western. Each will transport around 100,000 soldiers to Antarctica in the coming month. That will also include around 20,000 awakened, and 50 or so masters." She paused, and then added. "If the mobilization goes well, we will eventually have at least 60,000 awakened and anywhere between 100 and 300 masters participating in the evacuation efforts." Sonny took a deep breath. These numbers, while the amount of mundane humans being sent to Antarctica was much more immense, it were the latter two that gave him pause. 60,000 might not have seemed like much, but it meant that a quarter of all awakened in the world was going to be concentrated on one continent, and that was without even counting those who had already been based in the southern quadrant. The number of masters was even more unbelievable. 300 was more than a half of all ascended alive today. The government was truly pulling out all the stops. Such might. PD.new 1. But was it going to be enough? Sending so many awakened to war would also inevitably leave the other 3 quadrants with less protection, and their inhabitants more exposed to the vagaries of the nightmare spell. The pressure on the existing infrastructure was bound to increase dramatically after the flood of refugees reached the strongholds of humanity, too. It is all such a mess. Looking at the thousands of people moving around the temporary camp, Sonny couldn't help but wonder how many of them would be coming back. He had no choice but to wonder if he himself would survive, as well. Even though the members of the 1st Evacuation Army seemed trained and disciplined, he could see hints of fear and uncertainty hidden deep in their eyes. These people might have been dedicated and professional soldiers, but none of them had ever faced the kind of threat they were going to throw themselves against soon. Funnily enough, Sonny, despite his young age and lack of a service record, had come much closer to this kind of warfare and was much better prepared to withstand its horrors than most members of this hastily assembled army. Finally, he felt something that he had not felt even once since learning about the approaching disaster. The weight of responsibility slowly settled on his shoulders. Sonny sighed, and then mentally shook it off. What nonsense is this? He looked at Master Jet, lingered for a moment, and then asked. So, when do I get a dapper uniform? Chapter 8:14 Special Company. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Once they entered the confines of the port fortress, the human traffic lessened to a considerable degree. However, there were still plenty of people around, all moving with determined haste. Master Jet parked the PTV near a blocky, low building and opened the hatch to exit. Breathing in the cold winter air, she closed her eyes for a moment, and then let out a long sigh. After that, Soul Reaper glanced at him with a grin. Actually, you arrived just on time. The officer roster of our company is more or less full as of a few days ago, so we were about to hold our first briefing. It was supposed to start half an hour ago, but I postponed to come grab you from the train station. Sonny raised an eyebrow. Oh. Master Jet nodded. Everyone more or less only knows as much as you do, so I'll bring all of you up to speed in one go. Granted, the rest had more time to prepare, not to mention the fact that they have been with the government for years. Don't let those old dogs intimidate you, though. Sonny smiled. Do I look like someone who is easily intimidated? She glanced at him and laughed. You do, actually. That is one of your advantages, as far as I'm concerned. Being underestimated is always a boon. She walked forward at a brisk pace and said without looking back. The paperwork can wait for later. We'll get you settled and processed after the briefing. Usually, you would not have been allowed anywhere near the classified information without proper clearance and documentation, but these days proper procedure has taken a back seat to efficiency. Plus, there are very few people who can resist my charm. Sonny hurried to keep up with Master Jet as they entered the low building. After cutting through several checkpoints without anyone daring to look directly at Soul Reaper, let alone say something about the apparent civilian she was dragging into the guts of the military bunker with her, he understood that her status and reputation truly trampled procedure, at least to a large extent. Not only mundane humans, but even awakened treated her with fearful respect. Even an occasional master they walked past seemed to give her face. He hesitated, then asked with curiosity. Can I ask, what, exactly, is your official title in the First Army? Master Jet glanced at him, then smiled. Why, I am now Colonel Jet, Senior Officer of the 1st Awakened Irregular Company of the Northern Quadrant Corps of the Evacuation Army. Kind of a mouthful, huh? Sonny blinked a couple of times, then reached into his memory of the government force organization and hierarchy. He had studied the topic a bit before leaving the city. Wait, aren't companies supposed to be commanded by captains? Colonel is 3 or 4 ranks above that. It's just one step away from being a general. Soul Reaper nodded. Usually, you would be right. However, titles and authority become messy when awakened are involved. As a rule of thumb, awakened are 1 rank above what they would have been as mundane soldiers. That's just for normal ones, though. As irregulars, we will exist somewhat outside the army hierarchy, so our status was bumped up to reflect that. Sonny scratched the back of his head. Outside the hierarchy. What? He hesitated, then said in a subdued tone. I am not sure what irregulars mean. She flashed him a smile. You will be in a few minutes. Ednel.co.roalphad.newl.m. Together, they entered an elevator that brought them deep underground. Master Jet led him through winding corridors of the military bunker and then pressed the palm of her hand against a complicated biometric lock to open a thick alloy door. Sonny found himself in a spacious chamber that housed a large, round table. 5 individuals were already seated around it, quietly waiting for the start of the briefing. When Master Jet entered, they all stood up and saluted her. It was then that Sunny realized that all of them were ascended. 3 of them were men, while the other 2 were women. The oldest master seemed to be nearing his 50s, while the youngest was only slightly older than Soul Reaper. All of them wore serious expressions on their faces and looked at her with somber respect. She waved a hand. At ease. We are all ascended here. There's no need for ceremony. The masters hesitated for a few moments, then relaxed and sat down. Master Jet unbuttoned her navy blue trench coat, then threw it on the backrest of an empty chair. Sunny let out a heavy sigh, then made sure to look somewhere else. His cheeks suddenly started to burn, for no apparent reason. As it turned out, his new superior had dismissed her usual uniform in favor of a tight-fitting black bodysuit. In fact, all the masters present in the room were wearing one. It made sense. People like Sunny and them had no need of army-issued armor. They would all be using their memories in the field. A bodysuit like that could easily fit under any type of enchanted armor, so wearing it instead of a uniform was not only more convenient, but also practical. That didn't make it easy on Sunny, though. There were very few places he could rest his eyes on without potentially getting into trouble. It was pure torture. Master Jet sat down, prompting him to do the same. As much as Sunny was flustered by the black bodysuits, the rest of the Ascended were similarly confused by his civilian clothes and age. Finally, one of them glanced at Soul Reaper and asked. "Excuse me, ma'am. Who is this, young man? Is he your new adjutant?" She glanced at them, remained silent for a moment, and then smiled. He. Gods, no, this young man is Master Sunless, the latest and final additions to the command structure of the First Irregular Company. He is not only one of the youngest humans in history to reach the rank of an Ascended, but also has a kill count higher than most of you combined. So, give him a warm welcome, I guess. Chapter 8:15 First Irregular Company. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The 5 Ascended were surprised by such a colorful description, but quickly got over their shock. No one seemed to have doubts about Sunny's credentials, and for a simple reason, there were no weak masters. Every person who had chosen to challenge the second nightmare and survived was an elite by definition. So, his rank was the only proof of competence he needed to be accepted by them. That was not to say that these government officers felt threatened by Sunny's accomplishments. All of them were experienced, battle-tested fighters. Specialists. They had well-deserved confidence in their own capabilities. Master Jet looked at them and smiled. Since we have already started, let's get introductions out of the way. Some of you may know each other, while others are relatively new faces. She went down the line, introducing each of the Ascended that were going to serve as the backbone of the First Irregular Company. The oldest among them was a muscular man that seemed to be in his late 40s or early 50s. Of course, as an Ascended, he looked incredibly well for his age. Master Randall was mature and grizzled, with gray hair and a full beard that perfectly suited his chiseled, masculine face. The black bodysuit lay snug against his well-pronounced muscles. Everything about the man told that he was a seasoned, consummate soldier. His presence was solid and steady. Master Randall might have not fought side by side with the members of the first generation when the spell had appeared, but due to his age, he most likely witnessed its descent as a child. His well of experience was of great benefit to the company. In fact, one would have expected him to be in charge instead of Soul Reaper. However, even if the man had any thoughts about that matter, he did not let them show. The gorgeous woman sitting next to him stood out among the group of masters due to her good-natured, friendly demeanor. Ascended Jessie looked almost like the opposite of Master Jet. She had straw blonde hair, a healthy tan, sparkling blue eyes, and radiated a strange feeling of warmth. Coincidentally, she was the closest to Soul Reaper in terms of age. No one would have called the beautiful blonde soft, though. Her tall, slender body brimmed with energy and barely suppressed strength. The relaxed attitude hit a sharp and cutting edge. This master seemed to be not only enthusiastic about life, but also about combat and the carnage of battle. She was a formidable warrior, without a doubt. So were the others. The third woman among the officers of the company was called Ascended Winter. She was in her late 30s and seemed to be the most calm of the group. Her curly hair was dark brown and tied into a simple ponytail. Sunny didn't know what color her eyes were because, strangely, the woman wore a pair of polarized sunglasses even though they were all currently deep underground. She sat on her chair in a pose so relaxed that it almost seemed inappropriate for this important meeting. Her beautiful face was aloof and nonchalant. The sleeves of her bodysuit were rolled up, revealing toned forearms and a solid tattoo that turned one of them completely black. If not for the fact that Master Winter had stood up to salute Soul Reaper when they entered, Sunny would have thought that she was fast asleep. The man next to her seemed to have the same tattoo, hinting that they were, or had been, members of the same unit in the past. He was of the same age as his female colleague, with honest eyes and a gallant bearing. There was dark stubble on his handsome face, and black circles under his eyes. Ascended Dale seemed like a steady, stalwart warrior. Sunny did not know for sure, but felt that the man's aspect had at least some relation to defense and protection. He sensed that if Master Dale decided to stand his ground, very few things in the world would have been able to move him. The last officer of the first irregular company was slightly older and stood in stark contrast to Master Dale. His cold eyes, inexpressive face, and chilling gaze all expressed one thing. Ascended Davis was a killer. He seemed like the most offense-oriented master of the bunch, but that quality was not without subtlety. On the contrary, it seemed to be shrewd, quiet, and absolutely deadly. Sunny suspected that Davis was what he himself had once wished to be, the kind of fighter who utilized cunning and stealth to destroy the enemy with one surgical strike, thus avoiding the trouble of having to withstand retaliation. Together with Sunny and Jet, the 5 masters were going to lead the first irregular company. Coincidentally, just like Soul Reaper, each of the 5 Ascended had a nickname. Masters Randall, Jesse, Winter, Dale, and Davis were also known as Vandal, Mustang, Queen, Knight, and Pride. Sunny was the only person without one, which made him feel slightly jealous. Well, I can always go by Mongrel. He blinked. What? No. That's a terrible nickname, and an even worse idea. Who said that he even needed a nickname? He was perfectly fine being called Sunny, anyway. After the initial introductions were complete, Master Jet glanced at them again and said, "We will get to know each other's aspects and combat capabilities later. It is not too important for now, anyway, since I expect all of you to act independently of the rest more often than not. Now, let's get down to business. Today, I will bring you up to speed about the projected composition of the first irregular company, our purpose, and guiding military doctrine." She pressed something on her communicator, and a large projection appeared in the middle of the table. Sunny studied the large archipelago with a prominent landmass in the east. Master Jet lingered for a moment, and then continued. "But to do that, you will have to understand the general shape of the upcoming operation. As all of you already know, this is Antarctica." She gestured at the projection. All Antarctica is divided into 3 parts. Chapter 8:16 3 Phases. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Master Jet gestured to the projection. All of Antarctica is divided into 3 parts. West Antarctica, East Antarctica, and the Antarctic Center. West Antarctica was mostly submerged in water and consisted of a scattering of islands, some of them small, some of them large. East Antarctica was one large landmass that was peppered by numerous lakes, with a prominent mountain chain in the middle of it. The Antarctic Center was a long, narrow landmass that rested between the two, occupied almost entirely by tall mountains. Soul Reaper continued. West Antarctica is mostly devoid of human population, so it presents little interest to us. The Antarctic Center is an administrative and technological hub of the quadrant, while East Antarctica is the largest and most densely populated region of the continent. She paused for a moment, and then added somberly. The first evacuation army is going to set sail in 2 weeks. We will reach Antarctica 2, maybe 3 weeks after that. By that time, the chain of nightmares would already be starting. Local garrisons are already experiencing an increased number of manifesting gates, but the number will explode by the end of March. After that, it will only keep growing. Master Jet stared at the projection for a bit, and then said calmly. No matter how many soldiers we send, we won't be able to contain the flood of nightmare creatures that enter through these gates. This is something that had never happened in history before. Even the great wars that the first generation fought pale in comparison to the chain of nightmares. Don't forget that almost all abominations back then were of the dormant rank. We aren't that lucky. She sighed, then leaned back and crossed her arms. According to our scientists and diviners, the mass of gates is going to be of the second category and third categories. That means awakened, fallen, and even corrupted nightmare creatures, in numbers greater than anything we had seen. Of course, something even worse can happen. So, we are not going to try and contain them. The faces of the master slowly grew dim. Noticing it, Soul Reaper shook her head. There are better ways to achieve our objective. Once the army makes landfall, it will split into 3 parts, with each part pursuing a distinct objective during the first phase of the operation. One of the objectives is to turn a small number of select cities into fortified evacuation centers that can withstand the siege of nightmare creatures for months, or even years ahead. Master Jet pointed at several points on the map, then continued. The second objective is to relocate all external human population to these centers, where they will wait for their turn to board the ships. Neither the relocation nor the wait are going to be a short process. Finally, the third objective is to establish and maintain the evacuation corridors for the relocating citizens. Once everyone is safely behind the established perimeter of siege strongholds, the first phase of the operation will be considered to be complete. Sunny tentatively raised a hand. Yes. He glanced at other masters with a dubious expression, then asked. Why are we waiting for the disaster to strike before starting to evacuate people? Wouldn't it be easier to get at least some of them out right now? Soul Reaper gave him a rueful smile. That is because everyone was convinced that the event won't happen for at least a few more years. Our level of preparation is wholly inadequate, and there are no established means to start the evacuation prematurely. In short, the government was caught with its pants down. The deployment of the First Army is a messy and slapdash affair, which means that a lot more soldiers are going to die as the result. Make no mistake, though, this is the best we can do, considering the situation. Sunny sighed, then nodded in understanding. Master Jet glanced at him and continued. After the first phase of the operation is complete, the second one will commence. By then, the second evacuation army should be already fully formed and arrive to reinforce the depleted First Army. This phase is simple, which is not to say easy. We will pull back all our forces to the siege capitals and hold them for as long as it takes to evacuate every civilian. After that, the third phase will result in a complete exodus of humans from Antarctica and the consequent heavy continental bombardment. The southern quadrant will cease to exist. She took a poignant pause, then smiled darkly. That is the gist of the operation in broad strokes. Now, for details, as you must have already surmised from the name of our company, it is going to play a special role throughout all 3 phases of the evacuation. The first irregular company will not be tied to any existing battalion, regiment, or division. We will not be supporting or leading any of the grunt soldiers. Instead, we will act as elite irregulars. Soul Reaper leaned forward and looked at them with her icy blue eyes. Each of you will be in charge of a cohort of some of the best awakened warriors in the government employ. The cohorts will act semi-independently and respond to any overwhelming obstacle that threatens to slow down the evacuation. Whenever the mundane soldiers or their awakened counterparts encounter a problem that they can't handle, we will be sent to resolve the situation through any means necessary. The room suddenly became very cold, and so did Master Jet's expression. What it means is that we will be thrown into the most dire, bloody, and hopeless flashpoints of the entire operation on a consistent basis. Unlike regular soldiers who will most likely have time to rest and recover between battles, we will be enduring a constant succession of rapid combat deployments until the evacuation is completed, or until we all die. That is why the 1st Irregular Company was not only allocated 7 Ascended, but also why these Ascended are the absolute best we have. Each of you is an elite among elites. Make that count. She studied the faces of her subordinates, and then raised an eyebrow. Any questions? Master Winter suddenly raised a hand, revealing that she was not, in fact, asleep. When she spoke, her voice was unexpectedly relaxed. What's our logistics situation? Is there going to be food, or are we going to spend months chewing on monster meat? You know, like usual. Chapter 8:17 Captain Sunless. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The briefing lasted for a while longer. The 7 Ascended of the 1st Irregular Company had a lot of things to discuss, and while a few nuances went over Sonny's head, he slowly gained a better understanding of the upcoming ordeal. That said, each of them had way too much to do before the naval convoy left for the southern quadrant, so wasting precious time on long conversations was not in anyone's interest. Eventually, the 5 masters left, leaving Sonny and Jet alone in the meeting room. There was a grim expression on his face. Sonny sighed, then glanced at his superior. I am not going to lie, all of this seems a bit overwhelming. Soul Reaper smiled and shook her head dismissively. Don't be too concerned. You already have the necessary experience and qualifications to make things work. It is not like the others are better prepared to deal with something of that scope. Above all, we will need the ability to swiftly learn and adapt. That is how we will survive this unprecedented mess of a disaster. He looked at the ceiling with a thoughtful expression. Well, when Master Jet put it like that, yes, it made sense to say that he was qualified to face the challenges of the Chain of Nightmares. The other irregulars might have been older and more experienced, but no one had ever lived through something like that. In the absence of relevant experience, adaptability was arguably more important. In that regard, his young age and flexible mindset could even be called an advantage. Plus, Sonny had always excelled at being able to adapt to anything. Soul Reaper stood up and beckoned as she headed for the exit. Come on. Let's get you settled. They moved to a different level of the bunker, where some sort of administrative center had been hastily established in recent weeks. The military admins were even busier than the soldiers above ground. An atmosphere of feverish, barely contained chaos hung in the air as hundreds of officers tried to juggle tens of thousands of issues as they prepared the army for departure. Maybe because of this haste, or maybe because of Master Jet's presence, the paperwork did not take long. To Sonny's astonishment, it took less than half an hour for him to officially become a government agent and an officer of the 1st Evacuation Army. He was issued the rank of a captain, along with all the status and privileges of one. Sonny couldn't help but blink a couple of times. Captain Sunless, damn, it has a nice ring to it. Without wasting any time, they moved to another level, where Sonny was issued with a basic set of gear corresponding to his rank. Among other things, he also received the ubiquitous black bodysuit. His communicator was already of a high-grade government model, so it simply received an extensive software upgrade. As they waited for all the routine procedures to be performed, Sonny and Master Jet quietly discussed business. So, what exactly happens now? She looked at him for a few moments. Well, you will have to do a lot of things to get ready for Antarctica. Don't worry too much and take it one step at a time. Soul Reaper paused. First things first. In the next few days, you will have to make several important decisions. Don't rush and really think matters through before committing to a choice. However, don't wait too long, either. The longer you take, the less time you'll have to accomplish other tasks. She gestured to his communicator. All the necessary features and permissions have already been added to your comm. Your credentials should have been added into the system, as well, so you can access the data through it. Sunny checked the new features added to the operating system of his communicator and nodded. So what exactly are these decisions? Master Jet smiled. First of all, you are an officer of an elite combat unit now. The members of the First Irregular Company are entitled to receive a fair share of rare equipment and precious resources that the government has to offer. That said, each cohort is unique and has special demands. To make sure that you and your soldiers are outfitted with not only great tools, but also ones that suit them best, a very generous amount of contribution points has been added to your personal balance. She gestured to one of the symbols on the screen of his communicator. Your cohort will be provided with a basic set of assets, but on top of that, you will be able to customize them or acquire additional equipment yourself. You can peruse what the logistics and supply has to offer through that interface, as well as claim whatever you choose. Of course, the inventory available to the First Irregular Company is much more robust and exclusive than what mundane units have access to. Soul Reaper sighed wistfully. What you settle on is at your discretion. You can decide to upgrade your personal gear with powerful tools, memories, or even echoes. You can choose to equip your soldiers with better equipment instead. You can assign most points to comprehensively upgrade the technical assets provided to your cohort. Hell, you can even convert all the contribution points into credits and transfer them to your personal account, not that I would advise doing something like that, of course. Sunny's eyes glistened. If there was one thing he loved, it was receiving free stuff. Even if most of the contribution points would go into strengthening his cohort, it was still a great opportunity to soothe his greed. He was sure that the government had a lot of amazing stuff in its coffers. The decision to enlist was already starting to look much more appealing. There was one problem, however. He gave Master Jet a curious look. I can't really find tune gear and equipment to the needs of my cohort if I don't have a cohort, though. Right. She nodded. Indeed. Actually, that is the second set of decisions. Chapter 8:18 Irregulars, Assemble. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Master Jet pointed at another new symbol on the screen of his communicator. The process is basically the same. You can shop for members of the cohort through your comm, well, not really. Contribution points have nothing to do with the selection, of course. There is a pool of elite awakened fighters that have been transferred to this port. The First Irregular Company has priority right to recruit 40.2 of them, 6 per cohort. As the youngest captain, you get the first pick. Sunny stared at the screen, deep in thought. So, the first thing he had to do was to pick 6 awakened that would become his soldiers during the Antarctica campaign. He had no doubt that each of them was an elite warrior among the government forces, but being a good fighter was not enough. Creating a strong cohort was no small feat. Its members not only had to be able to pull their own weight, but also meet a long list of needs that a combat unit possessed. This was especially true for the 7 cohorts that were going to comprise the First Irregular Company, since each of them was expected to operate independently. In a sense, this approach was more familiar to him. Awakened serving a large force were able to specialize within the confines of their units. One cohort could do especially well in melee combat, but lacked the means of dealing damage from range. Another cohort could specialize in attacking exclusively from distance. By working together, these different units were able to shore up each other's weaknesses and allow the soldiers to express their greatest strengths. An independent cohort was very different. Although it could possess a specialization, it had to be well-rounded and excel in various aspects by necessity. This is how most cohorts in the Dream Realm functioned, and what Sunny was familiar with. In any case, choosing 6 awakened that could fulfill a multitude of roles while synergizing with each other was a daunting task. There was a lot of factors he would have to consider. And after that, he had to assume command of these strangers and lead them into battle after battle. Their survival was his responsibility. Their deaths, should any of his soldiers fall, would be on his conscience, too. Sunny let out a long sigh, then looked at Master Jet. Any advice? She lingered for a few moments, then nodded. No matter how good these elites are, you will still be the core element and the deadliest weapon of the cohort. Don't neglect variability, but choose those whose aspects complement yours. Sunny smiled. Ah, that won't be a problem. I might not excel in any one thing, but at the same time, I am sort of a jack of all trades. While my aspect leans toward utility, I can do a bit of everything. That leaves me at a disadvantage in some situations, but it also means that I can work well with a great variety of awakened. Anyone can benefit from having me by their side, and vice versa. Master Jet thought for a few moments. Versatility is a strength in and of itself. Since you are not limited by a narrow focus, the best course of action would be to assemble a well-balanced group of fighters that can respond to any situation with a high level of effectiveness. That will actually make my job a bit easier, since I'll be able to send your cohort to solve a wider variety of problems. She lingered for a bit, and then added. If there is one piece of advice I can give, it's to not neglect utility in favor of direct combat strength. Antarctica, no matter how prepared we think we are, it is going to test us in ways that no one expects. Things will go wrong, and then go from bad to worse. Mobility, survival, mental resilience, all these things and plenty others might turn out to be much more important than we think. It is also going to be a long, cruel, and punishing campaign. Keep that in mind. Sunny sighed. Long, cruel, and punishing, that was basically the description of most of his experiences with the nightmare spell. That was nothing new. He stared at his communicator for a bit, then asked. What about after I've assembled the cohort? Most of these soldiers are probably older than me. They are also devoted government servants, while I am somewhat of a hired mercenary. I doubt that they will be happy to be under command of someone like me, instead of one of the other distinguished masters. Soul Reaper shook her head. You are not exactly correct. Sure, you are younger than the other captains of our company. Some might see it as a weakness, but at the same time, it's a sign of excellence and greater potential. After all, none of us managed to ascend before turning 20. I am considered somewhat of a prodigy, and you beat my record by 5 years. So, I don't expect these soldiers to show reluctance to respect your command. She paused, then added in a serious tone. However, there is a great difference between being able to issue orders and being able to inspire confidence. There is no easy method to make your soldiers follow you, not simply obey you. You will have to find a way to win their loyalty on your own, Sunny. Master Jet smiled. However, I don't think that it will be too hard. Once we reach Antarctica, things will fall into place. Lead them to victory, keep them alive, and they'll learn to trust you. Sunny thought for a bit, then nodded. Action spoke louder than words. He might face some resistance at the start, but battle would swiftly resolve everything. Either he would win his soldiers over, or all 7 of them would die. In any case, the problem was going to disappear. Soul Reaper briefly gripped his shoulder, and then said. Anyway, I don't think you should worry about these matters yet. You have plenty of other issues to solve. No matter how professional and prepared these guys are, forming a strong cohort takes more than simply assembling all its members together. You will all have to learn how to fight side by side and leverage your unique powers to form good synergy. Well, I don't have to tell you. You're not a novice. Sunny scratched the back of his head. Yeah. I have some experience with that. She sighed. Do remember that you will only have 3, maybe 4 weeks left to prepare. That is not nearly enough time to deepen the cooperation level of the cohort, but do as much as you can. There will be proper training facilities aboard the ships, so don't stop working until we make landfall. Sunny looked at her with a serious expression. I won't. Master Jet nodded, then waved a hand. Well, I bet you have enough to think about. I'll leave you to it, then. Don't take too much time deciding on who you want to recruit. The sooner you settle that, the sooner you can start bringing your cohort to shape and spending those sweet contribution points. He smiled and looked as she turned around and disappeared into one of the corridors of the underground bunker. Then, Sunny lowered his gaze and studied the screen of his communicator. He had a lot to think about, indeed. Chapter 8:19 Alloy Beast. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The room provided to Sunny was a far cry from the luxurious cabin he had enjoyed on the train. It was small, Spartan, and lacked windows due to being located deep underground. The designers of the military bunker did not even install a false one, so the walls lacked the lifelike projections of the outside. Not that Sunny cared about such things. In fact, he quite liked the solid nature of his temporary quarters. Perhaps things would have been different if he did not possess the ability to escape to the surface with the help of Shadow Step, but since he did, the fear of being buried under countless tons of stone and soil was not bothering him too much. The room reminded him of his hidden lair in the ruined cathedral of the Dark City, which was a pleasant bonus. Sitting on a narrow bed, Sunny sighed and projected the screen of his communicator on the opposite wall. Leaning back, he then got lost in thought for a few minutes. In the next day or so, he would have to make a lot of important decisions. There were a lot of things to consider. While the task seemed daunting, he was rather excited to start. It's like playing a game, only without checkpoints and real human lives at stake. Including mine. So, I guess nothing like a game, actually. The first thing he did was acquaint himself with the default set of assets provided to his future cohort by the government. This generous and highly optimized array of premium gear and equipment included everything to cover the basic needs of his unit during their deployment in Antarctica, from thermoregulated outerwear to priceless Spelltech medical kits and beyond. The centerpiece of the set was, without a doubt, an advanced all-terrain personnel carrier that was going to serve as the mobile home of his cohort in the future. This heavily armored transport vehicle resembled an angular, high-tech mix between a turtle and a rhinoceros. Of course, Sunny only knew what a rhinoceros was because he had looked up the extinct beast after learning that the APC was colloquially known as rhino. It was hard to believe that the massive thing was an actual animal and not a strange nightmare creature. Despite its prodigious size and thick armor, the Rhino armored personnel carrier was capable of moving with immense speed across various terrains. It could even climb mountains without too much problem, provided that the driver knew what they were doing. The advanced variant provided to the cohorts of the first irregular company was additionally modified with even more robust armor, inordinately powerful engines, enhanced internals, and a sophisticated command and communications suite. Of course, there was always room for improvement. In fact, the interface offered Sunny a lot of opportunities to enhance the APC much further. These additional augmentations were going to cost him a lot of contribution points, however. Still, he was inclined to believe that they would be worth it. The armored vehicle was not only going to be responsible for keeping his cohort mobile, it would also serve as the logistical core of their deployment. Its importance was already apparent due to the fact that the default set of assets provided by the government was based on its carrying capacity. The logistics and supply officers in charge of compiling this array of gear were not familiar with the covetous coffer, of course. Thanks to his loyal toothy chest, Sunny would be able to more or less double his cohort storage space. That alone gave him a lot of flexibility as far as spending contribution points on additional equipment was concerned. The tech is important, however, it is also unreliable. Gates were known to mess with technology in various ways. The military vehicle certainly included several measures to minimize that effect, but it would still be prudent of him to beef this aspect up. After all, no one knew what would happen if dozens, or even hundreds of gates came to exist in the area around the APC at the same time. That was something for Sonny to think about later, however. Now that he knew what he was dealing with, he had a clearer picture of what kind of awakened he wanted to recruit. Closing one interface and opening another, he rubbed his temples and sighed. That is not going to be easy. Soon enough, hundreds of concise dossiers were in front of him, each containing the personnel file of one of the best awakened soldiers stationed in the port. Most of them were going to be assigned to other units, while 40.2 would become members of the elite 1st Irregular Company. 6 of them would be his own subordinates. For a while, Sonny was paralyzed by all the choice. Each dossier contained the description of the awakened's aspect and abilities, their service record, and psychological profile, as well as of additional skills and specializations that the soldier might have mastered and other information. His task was to pick 6 warriors who would not only comprise a well-rounded cohort and complement his own powers, but also work well with each other both in terms of combat ability and interpersonal compatibility. The former was already hard enough, but the latter gave him a headache. Luckily, very few people working for the government possessed contrarian and antisocial personalities. People who chose the life of service were predisposed to having a certain level of agreeableness by definition. Unlike Sonny. He was contrarian and antisocial enough to balance out their agreeableness all by himself. One thing that the files did not include, regretfully, was detailed information about the flaws of these elite soldiers. Not even the government servants were comfortable sharing something like that with their employer. Each file only mentioned how severe the flaw had been judged to be through passive observation, and sometimes an approximate evaluation of its specific effects. Which was a shame. A serious enough flaw could derail any battle plan. Just out of curiosity, Sonny looked up the dossiers of the other ascended captains, Vandal, Mustang, Queen, Knight, and Pride, as well. Their files were also there, although in a much more redacted version. Reading what little was left unredacted, he couldn't help but whistle. Impressive. Master Jet's personal file was even more obscure. Pretty much everything except for her name and rank was blacked out. His own dossier was rather short and mostly consisted of question marks. Either the government truly knew so little about him, or simply chose not to show how well they were informed. Well, at least they got my height right. Sonny closed the file and shook his head. He could not allow himself to delay the task any further. He was in for a long and sleepless night. Chapter 8:20 Importance of Utility. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Sonny knew what he needed, more or less. A couple of frontline fighters, a couple of ranged specialists, someone to provide utility. A healer, ideally, although even among these elites, there were too few. Fortunately, Sonny himself possessed a wide range of versatile abilities that could cover many needs of the cohort. He was able to fight up close or at range. He could scout or flank the enemies by using shadow step. He could use shadow manipulation to accomplish a multitude of tasks. Still, covering all the basics was not enough. The Antarctica campaign was promising to be long and grueling, maybe even unbearable. He had no doubt that they would face all kinds of nightmare creatures, from land-bound to aerial to aquatic. Some of them were going to try and kill them with brutal force, some would employ more insidious means. To ensure the best chances of survival, the cohort had to be strong, balanced, and capable of accomplishing more than the sum of its parts would suggest. They had to be able to work together and respond to all kinds of threats. Even with several hundred candidates, he was not sure how possible it was to build something as formidable as his own cohort had been, both on the Forgotten Shore and the Chained Isles. First things first. Although some would have been tempted to go for offensive powerhouses first, Sonny made a different opinion. He filtered the dossiers, allowing only those of awakened with utility aspects to remain. Master Jet had been right, although pure combat strength was immensely important, a war was often lost or won off the battlefield. As far as Sunny was concerned, utility was just as vital. His own experience confirmed it. Back on the Forgotten Shore, fighters like Nephice and Castor had shone so bright that everyone paid them all the attention. People like Sunny and Cassie remained more or less unnoticed. However, they had contributed as much, if not more, to the cohort's survival. Yes, those with pure combat aspects played a larger role in direct confrontations with the nightmare creatures. But it was only because Sunny had scouted ahead that they had been able to avoid battling swarms of abominations that would have overwhelmed them in an instant. Cassie's uncanny intuition and affinity to revelation had saved them too many times to count. It had helped the cohort avoid lethal dangers that often could not be seen, let alone slain with a blade. Not paying enough attention to utility would have been a grave mistake. More than that, this choice would allow Sunny to hand-pick other members of the cohort to suit the ensuing situation. The first decision would widen and define the cohort's foundation, making the rest easier to make. He spent a lot of time reading through dozens of dossiers. There were all kinds of talented Awakened that possessed incredible abilities. Eventually, Sunny narrowed the selection to just 3 of the most interesting candidates. A mature and experienced Awakened caught his eye due to the ability to move and shape Earth as if it was a liquid, and then swiftly turn it back to solid state. With his help, the cohort would be able to literally shape the battlefield to stack the odds in their favor. While that ability was too slow and weak to deal direct damage, Sunny could imagine building all types of funnels, defensive walls, and trenches with the man's help. Hell, in certain situations, they would even be able to turn the ground into quicksand, trapping multiple abominations or at least reducing the mobility of the enemy. Their own mobility was also an issue. No matter how versatile the Rhino was, there would be situations, without a doubt, where its incredible all-terrain maneuverability would fail. The ability to create a road was going to come in extremely handy at that time. Another government elite seemed even more useful. This tall and athletic man was capable of creating stable short-distance spatial rifts. Basically, he could allow the fighters of the cohort to teleport around the battlefield with impunity. Sunny did not have to think long to understand how incredible this ability was. He had used Shadow Step to vanquish his foes numerous times, and granting the same advantage to the whole cohort was an indescribably potent tool. Hell, he didn't even have to send people through this rift. Throwing a Spelltech grenade or a manifestation of a sorceress aspect ability would wreak havoc among the enemies just as well. The third candidate was a young woman with mousy hair and an unassuming face. Her ability seemed less potent than that of the 2 men, but could also be quite useful in the right situations. Just like Cassie, the young woman possessed an affinity to revelations, be it a much lesser one. While she couldn't compete with Song of the Fallen in the broadness of application, the narrow focus of her aspect was capable of producing more palpable results. The young woman was able to perceive weaknesses and vulnerabilities of living creatures, as well as share visual perception among several people. She, too, could comprehensively enhance the cohort's battle effectiveness, although in a less direct way. Sunny spent a long time staring at the 3 dossiers. Which one should he choose? Each held incredible value in his eyes. He was even tempted to claim all 3. But no. While Sunny was not blind to the importance of utility, he needed powerful fighters to make use of it. Without offensive strength, the cohort would be simply unable to act on the provided opportunities. Plus, his own aspect already leaned toward utility. Eventually, he dismissed the dossiers of the 2 men and left only the image of the meek young woman with mousy hair on the wall. Awakened Kim. The more Sunny stared at her portrait, the more he was sure of his choice. Yes, the first candidate could shape the battlefield to their advantage. But Sunny was able to achieve a bit of that himself with the help of shadow manifestation. Yes, the second candidate could provide an indescribable tactical flexibility to the cohort. However, the short range and the stationary nature of the spatial rifts was not easy to exploit in the chaotic and unpredictable mayhem of combat. Awakened Kim, on the other hand, could provide a powerful boost to any offensive action. Her ability synergized with the widest variety of aspects, including Sunny's own. More than that, unlike the other two soldiers, her powers scaled with the threat. Being able to create a wall of stone was useless if the enemy could turn stone to dust. Being able to attack an abomination from the flank would accomplish nothing if the abomination was of a high enough rank to become immune to awakened weapons. Being able to see the vulnerabilities of the enemy, however, would be a boon for the cohort no matter how powerful of an enemy they faced. In fact, the more dire their foe, the more important awakened Kim's ability could become. There was also another, much simpler reason why Sunny decided to choose the third candidate. The young woman could share visual perception between multiple people. Antarctica, meanwhile, enjoyed an uninterrupted night that lasted for several months. What it meant was that the first irregular company would be fighting in near-complete darkness for at least 4 months after arriving into the southern quadrant. While this problem could be somewhat solved with technology, there was a better and more reliable solution. Sunny could see in the dark, and with awakened Kim's help, his soldiers would share in this ability, too. He looked at the dossier one last time and nodded. Good. This young woman was going to be the first cornerstone of his cohort.